Good evening, dear listener. So, it's been a little while since I recorded the last Sleep Lore video. And as I mentioned before, life kind of got in the way a little bit of these, but I've kind of started the year with the intention of recording a lot more videos and trying to really get myself into this a little bit more. But with that in mind, I've also put some thought into the nature of how I record these and how kind of I introduce these. First of all, I've kind of changed my microphone setup around a little bit, but also I wanted to kind of start each video to add a bit more of a personal element to this, to try and explain why this topic is important to me, what the topic is, and why I think it could maybe be important to you as well. So don't worry, I'm going to get on with the business of helping you fall asleep very, very soon. But I thought I'd spend a minute here talking a little bit about this video, which is Fallout. The Fallout series is one of my favourite video games of all time, favourite video game series of all time, to be fair. And I kind of swap between the Elder Scrolls and Fallout as kind of those open world games that I kind of really fell in love with. And while sometimes I get a bit bored of open world games, I never ever get bored of the Fallout world. And Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 4 are some of the most formative games of my youth, and those, along with kind of Skyrim, Oblivion, and Morrowind, were kind of games I really threw myself in and kind of really got lost in a little bit. And while the original games aren't sort of games in terms of the gameplay that I've really got into, the lore I've just devoured over the years. There's a particular podcast called Fallout Lorecast by Robots Radio that I would definitely recommend that you guys go and have a listen to. I mean, the guy has no idea who I am, but who does it, but it's really, really good, and it's helped me drift off to sleep many a time, so I'd definitely recommend that. Anyway, with that in mind, I suppose we should get on with it, shouldn't we? So let's dig in with Fallout, the day the bombs fell. There is a world that exists only in memory now. A world of chrome automobiles and optimistic jingles, of towering cities and atomic dreams. It was a world that looked forward, always forward, towards a future of limitless possibility. And then, on a quiet Saturday morning in late October, that world came to an end. The Great War, as it came to be called, lasted about 2 hours. In that brief window of time, civilization, as it had existed for centuries, simply ceased to be. The exchange of nuclear weapons between nations, primarily United States and China, transformed the planet. Cities burned. The sky darkened with ash and fallout. Billions of lives ended before most people understood what was happening. This is the event that defines everything that follows in the Wasteland. Every rusted building, every creature wandering in the irradiated plains, every community struggling to survive, all of it traces back to that single autumn morning. The date was October 23rd, 2077. Why does this matter, though? Why speak of something so distant, so catastrophic? Because the world that rose from those ashes is built upon the bones of the one that came before. The vaults where people sheltered, a technology that still functions in unexpected places, the mutations that created new forms of life. All of these are consequences of that day. To understand the Wasteland is to understand what was lost, and how quickly it was lost, and how unprepared so many were for its coming. The sirens did sound that morning. Air raid warnings echoed through the cities across the continent. But people had heard such warnings before. Drills had become routine during the long years of tension, and many assumed it was simply another exercise, another reminder to remain vigilant. They did not seek shelter. They continued with their morning routines, making breakfast, preparing for work, watching television. The vaults sealed their doors, but not everyone who could have entered chose to do so. It is said the exchange began in the morning hours on the East Coast. Reports suggested missiles were detected, retaliations were ordered, and within minutes the sky was full of warheads tracing their arcs towards targets below. Some clocks across the wasteland remained frozen, 9:47, marking the moment when so many systems went silent forever. Who fired first remains uncertain. Some accounts point to China, driven to desperation by years of costly war and dwindling resources. Other whispers from the TV show suggest a more complicated origins, conspiracies involving corporations and shadow governments with their own reasons for wanting the world to end. In truth, if it exists anymore, lies buried beneath rubble and radiation. Perhaps it never mattered. The world had been moving towards this moment for decades, pulled by currents of resources scarcity and political fear that no single nation could control. What is certain is this: when the bombs stopped falling, the earth was changed forever. The landscape transformed. Weather patterns shifted, rain fell back with contamination for days afterwards, killing many who had survived the initial blasts. Ecosystems collapsed and reformed in strange new configurations. Creatures mutated, plants adapted, or perished. And yet, life persisted. As they say, life found a way. In the vaults behind thick steel doors and miles of rock, small communities of people waited. On the surface, those fortunate or stubborn enough to find shelter in basements or subway tunnels and drainage systems and any dark corner that offered protection clung to existence. Some of these survivors would emerge weeks or months or years later to find a world they no longer recognized, but a world all the same. The Great War was not simply a catastrophe. It was a hinge point, the moment where one version of human civilization gave way to another. Everything that came after, the struggles, the communities, the factions fighting over scraps of the old world, all of it flows from that single Saturday morning where the future everyone had imagined was replaced by something else entirely. The bombs fell, the world ended, and then, slowly, haltingly, imperfectly, something new began to grow in the silence that followed. The world before the war was not like our own. It looked similar in many ways, but the path it had taken was different, shaped by choices made long ago that sent history down an unfamiliar road. Sometime after the Second World War, the trajectory of progress shifted. The details of when or why remain unclear, lost perhaps to the chaos that followed. But the result was unmistakable. Technology advanced, uncertainly, but it advanced in different directions. The miniaturization of electronics that might have occurred did not happen in the same way. Computers remained large, built around vacuum tubes and reel-to-reel tape systems rather than compact circuitry that another world might have developed. Our world. Desktop terminals were bulky things with small, monochromatic screens, yet they were built to last. Many of them still function centuries later, humming quietly in abandoned offices and ruined buildings, waited for someone to read the stored memories. I sometimes consider whether or not our real world would survive in the same way. Technology is not created to last in our world, but in the world of Fallout, it was. Food for thought. This was a world that looked forward with tremendous optimism. The aesthetic of mid-century America persisted and flourished, stretching into the late 21st century. Chrome automobiles with sweeping fins rolled down highways. Diners served food on bright plastic trays. Advertisements promised futures of comfort and convenience, all powered by the atom. There was a cheerfulness to the surface of things, a belief that science and industry would solve every problem humanity might face. And in many ways, this belief seemed justified. The atom had been harnessed not just for weapons, but for daily life. Nuclear power found its way into countless applications. By the middle of the 21st century, fusion energy emerged as a practical technology, first developed as an offshoot of military research into power armor. Microfusion cells became commonplace, small and efficient enough to power everything from household appliances like fridges to automobiles to military technology. The Chrysler's Converger, a sleek sedan with a fusion engine beneath its hood, represented the promise of limitless clean energy. Cars no longer needed gasoline. They ran on the atom itself. Robots became part of ordinary life. Companies like Robco Industries and General Atomics International manufactured machines for every purpose imaginable. The Protectrons stood guard in shops and public buildings, a friendly, if somewhat clumsy, mechanical presence. The Mr. Handy floated through homes on quiet thrusters, preparing meals and performing household chores. iBots drifted through city streets, broadcasting news and music. Sentry bots patrolled military installations, bristling with weapons, and these machines were everywhere, integrated into the fabric of society, and their circuits and servos humming along in service to human convenience. The great corporations held tremendous power in this world. Robco Industries, founded by the industrialist Mr. House, produced not only robots, but the operating systems that ran nearly every computer terminal in the country. Robert House's partnership with Voltec was described as the most successful joint venture in American industrial history. General Atomics built household robotics and collaborated on military projects. Westech developed advanced weapons and biological research. Poseidon Energy controlled vast portions of the power infrastructure. Nuka-Cola sold soft drinks to a nation that could not get enough of them, and the companies that shaped the landscape of daily life, logos appeared on products and buildings from coast to coast. Voltec occupied a particular place in the public imagination. The company had secured government contracts to construct underground shelters, vast bunkers designed to protect citizens. Unbeknownst to most, however, many of these vaults were designed not only as shelters, but as controlled and horrific social experiments. These vaults were markedly heavy, the cheerful mascot appearing on posters and television adverts. The promise was simple. If the worst should happen, if the bomb should fall, there would be a place to hide, a place to wait out the devastation and emerge into a new world. Families purchased spaces in these shelters, communities formed around the promise of survival, and the vaults represented hope, or the appearance of hope at least. Power armor emerged as one of the most striking achievements of this technological era, developed initially for military use. These walking suits of armor turned individual soldiers onto something approaching small tanks. Powered by fusion packs, encased in thick plating, equipped with strength-enhancing hydraulics, power armor changed the nature of infantry warfare. American forces deployed these suits in conflict overseas, and their presence on the battlefield proved decisive in many engagements. Yet beneath the gleaming surface, pressures were building. The world's petroleum reserves were dwindling. The fusion technology that powered so many marvels had arrived late, too late to prevent the crisis already unfolding. By the early 2060s, traffic on the streets of the world had slowed dramatically. Fuel had become too precious to waste on personal automobiles. Electric and fusion-powered vehicles entered production, but factories could only manufacture limited numbers. The infrastructure of the old world, built on assumptions of endless fossil fuels, could not transform itself quickly enough. The great corporations continued their work. The robots kept rolling off assembly lines, and the vaults continued their construction. 122 of them scattered across the country. The advertisements kept promising bright tomorrows, but the foundations were shifting, cracking in ways that most people could never see. The world before the war was a place of wonders, genuine wonders, achievements that still shape the wasteland today. It was also a place balanced on the edge of something terrible, moving steadily towards a morning in late October when all those promises will be tested against the reality of fire and ash. The cracks appeared gradually, so slowly in fact that many did not notice them at all. The world of chrome and promise, of atomic dreams and better living, began to show signs of strain long before the final catastrophe. These were quiet years in some ways, years when the troubles seemed distant, happening elsewhere to other people. But the foundations were shifting. In the early 2050s, the first series of fractures emerged on the international stage. The European Commonwealth, a union of nations across the Atlantic, found itself desperately dependent on oil from the Middle East. When prices began to rise, when petroleum-rich states demanded more and more of their dwindling reserves, Europe did not negotiate. Europe went to war. The conflict that erupted in the spring of 2052 sent shockwaves through the global order. Almost immediately, oil prices everywhere climbed to staggering heights. Small nations, unable to afford the fuel that powered their economies, began to collapse. Governments fell. Currencies became worthless. The comfortable assumptions that the world systems would continue functioning as they always had proved to be fragile indeed. The United Nations tried to intervene. For decades, this body had served as a forum for nations to resolve their differences, or at least to speak to one another. But the debates grew heated. Countries withdrew, one after another, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to share what little remained. By the end of July 2052, the United Nations disbanded entirely. The organization that had meant to prevent another world war simply ceased to exist. Its headquarters in New York eventually sold off, the building repurposed for commerce. Across the ocean, the United States watched these developments with growing unease. The government had already begun exerting pressure on Mexico, securing access to oil refineries south of the border through economic sanctions and military presence. Now, with Europe at war and international institutions crumbling, a new anxiety settled over the nation. The cheerful advertisements continued, the robots still hummed through their tasks, but beneath the surface, people began to wonder what might come next. Then came the plague. In 2053, a new illness appeared. It spread quickly, passing from person to person in ordinary social situations. The symptoms resembled as severe flu at first. Sounds familiar, right? But the disease progressed rapidly, killing tens of thousands across the country. Cities like Denver, Boulder, and Colorado Springs saw the worst of it. The source of the plague remained unknown, though rumors circulated it might be a weapon, something engineered rather than natural. No one could say for certain. The government responded with unprecedented measures. For the first time in the nation's history, a full quarantine was declared. Borders closed, travel restrictions went into effect. The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the optimistic surface of American life now had something concrete to attach itself to. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion. Assemblies were discouraged. The authorities used fear to tighten their grip, to encourage citizens to report anything that seemed subversive. As if to punctuate the year's horrors, a terrorist nuclear weapon detonated in Tel Aviv that December. The city was destroyed. The perpetrators were never identified with certainty, but the message was clear. Nuclear weapons, the terrible instruments that everyone had hoped would never be used again, had returned to the world stage. The following months brought limited nuclear exchanges in the Middle East itself, small scale to compare to what would eventually come, but enough to send waves of fear across the globe. In response to these cascading crises, the United States government initiated Project Safehouse in 2054. The plan was ambitious: a network of underground shelters, vaults, scattered across the nation, capable of protecting the population from nuclear war or plague or whatever other catastrophe might arrive. Vault-Tec, the defense contractor selected to build these shelters, began construction with remarkable speed. Advances in building technology allowed the massive bunkers to take shape rapidly, their great gear-shaped doors promising safety to those fortunate enough to secure a place inside. The vaults became symbols of hope, or at least preparedness. Families applied for spaces, communities organized around the promise of survival. Vault-Tec's cheerful mascot appeared on posters and advertisements, thumb raised in optimistic salute. Better living underground, slogans promised. Be prepared for the future today. Yet the governments financing these shelters were not wealthy. The project was funded through junk bonds, and only a fraction of the population would ever fit inside. 122 vaults were commissioned, enough for perhaps a tiny percentage of American citizens. The rest would have to trust that the worst would never happen, that shelters were merely a precaution, that the future promised by all those gleaming advertisements would still arrive. The consumer culture continued, its bright surfaces undimmed. People still bought cars and appliances, they watched television and listened to radio. They still believed, or tried to believe, that everything would be fine. But the unease had taken root. The world beyond the borders was falling apart, and the walls built to keep that chaos out were growing higher and higher every year. The war came slowly first, then all at once. For years, the relationship between the United States and China had been deteriorating. Both nations watched each other across the Pacific with growing suspicion, each convinced that the other posed an existential threat. The ideological differences that had defined the previous century remained, but now something more immediate drove that tension. The world was running out of oil. Both powers needed what little remained. China's economy depended heavily on fossil fuels. Unlike the United States, which had begun developing fusion technology, China had not transitioned away from petroleum. By the middle of the 2060s, global oil fields were drying up one after another. China found itself facing economic collapse, its industry sputtering, its people growing desperate. When the United States declared an embargo on petroleum exports in 2066, refusing to share its remaining reserves with any foreign nation, China's leadership confronted an impossible situation. That same summer, the United States unveiled its first crude fusion cell, a technological breakthrough developed through military research. The timing could not have been worse for relations between the two powers. America was moving forward towards energy independence while China starved for fuel. Negotiations grew aggressive. Diplomacy failed. In the winter of 2066, Chinese forces launched an invasion of Alaska under the command of General Jingwei. The People's Liberation Army crossed the Bering Strait in a massive military operation. The scale of the assault stunned observers. Within hours, Chinese forces had seized control of Alaska's oil fields and a trans-Alaskan pipeline. The United States military had established the Anchorage front line years earlier, anticipating this possibility, but the speed and scale of the Chinese assault overwhelmed initial defenses. American forces retreated, regrouped, and began planning what would be called the Anchorage Reclamation. What followed stretched across an entire decade. The fighting in Alaska resembled conflicts from an earlier age. Trenches scarred the frozen landscape. Supply lines stretched thin across impossible distances. Progress came slowly, measured in blood and suffering. Neither side could break the deadlock through conventional means. To reach the Alaskan front, American forces needed passage through Canada. The United States pressured its northern neighbor into granting military access, and though Canada initially cooperated, the arrangement grew increasingly bitter. American troops moved through Canadian provinces as if borders meant nothing. Resources flowed southward to feed the war effort. By 2069, vast stretches of Canadian wilderness had been stripped for timber and minerals. Many Americans had begun referring to Canada as Little America, and Canadian protests went unheard. The first functional power armor, the T-45, deployed to Alaska in '67. These walking suits of steel changed the nature of the conflict. Soldiers encased in power armor could advance through positions that had stopped conventional infantry for months. The technology helped stabilize the front, but could not break the stalemate entirely. In 2072, tensions with Canada finally snapped. Riots erupted in several Canadian cities. When saboteurs attempted to destroy the trans-Alaskan pipeline, the United States military used the incident as justification to begin formal annexation. What had been an ally became occupied territory. General Buzz Babcock announced that the Little America had always belonged to the United States. Protesters were shot. By Jan 76, Canada ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Pictures of atrocities committed in the name of security made their way across the border, sparking unrest among American citizens who grew concerned about what their country had become. The war expanded beyond Alaska. In 2074, American forces landed on the Chinese mainland, carrying the fight to enemy soil. Power army units, infantry divisions, and mechanized forces pushed into China itself. The stated goal was to end the war quickly, to force a surrender. Instead, the campaign became a quagmire. The aging T-45 armor proved insufficient against determined Chinese defenders. American units found themselves bogged down, their supply lines stretched to breaking. China responded with biological weapons on the Alaskan front. The United States countered by ordering the development of a pan-immunity virion, research that would eventually produce something called the forced evolutionary virus, though that consequence lay in the future. The completion of the T-51 power armor in June 2076 marked a turning point. This new generation outperformed its predecessors in every aspect. Chinese troops began surrendering upon seeing soldiers in T-51 armor carrying miniguns. American units made real progress, pushing the enemy back. In January 2077, Anchorage was finally liberated under General Constantine Chase. But victory in Alaska only shifted the stalemate to China. The war in the mainland ground forward without resolution. Billions of dollars and countless lives had been spent. Peace talks scheduled after Anchorage went nowhere. By spring of 2077, those with access to classified information understood what was coming. The president and key governmental officials quietly retreated. To secure locations, preparing for nuclear or biological attack. Neither side would yield. Something else would have to end it. The end of the world came on a Saturday, the 23rd of October 2077, a morning like countless mornings before it. In homes across the country, people woke up to ordinary routines. Coffee was brewed, breakfast was prepared, children readied themselves for activities, for trips, for the small adventures that fill a weekend. The radio played music and news. Television flickered with programs and advertisements, and outside, the autumn air carried a particular coolness of late October. The war had been going on for so long it had become almost normal. News from the front arrived regularly, soldiers fought in distant places, the government issued statements about progress and sacrifice. But here, in the kitchens and living rooms of America, life continued as it always had. The conflict felt far away. Something that had happened to other people in other places. Few knew what was unfolding in the early hours of that morning. Shortly after midnight, the United States Pacific Fleet detected unidentified submersible objects off the coast of California. Hours later, a squadron of high-altitude aircraft was spotted near the Bering Strait. Military personnel monitored these developments through the long watches of the night, but ordinary citizens slept unaware. At 30 minutes past 9 in the morning, Eastern Time, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System registered something that would change everything. 4 missile launches confirmed. The country moved to its highest state of alert. 4 minutes later, the North American Aerospace Defense Command verified what the detection systems had found. Missiles were in the air, tracing their arcs across the sky towards American cities. At 26 minutes past 9, the president authorized a retaliatory strike. The scenario had been planned for, documented, assigned a destination, and now it was real. American weapons rose to meet the incoming threat. The answer to destruction was destruction. The first detonations occurred on the west coast. Then, at 42 minutes past 9, nuclear warheads struck Pennsylvania and New York. 5 minutes later, most American monitoring facilities went silent. Washington fell into darkness. The capital, the seat of government, the symbol of the nation, was consumed. Air raid sirens began to sound across the country. The wailing rose and fell with a distinctive tone it had tested so many times before. Drills had conditioned people to hear this sound, and they know what it meant. Seek shelter. Proceed to your designated location. This is not a test. But it had been a test so many times. The sirens had again cried wolf, and again over the years, summoning people to shelters for exercises that had always ended with everyone going home. The drills had created a strange complacency. When a siren sounded that morning, many people assumed it was just another practice run. They continued with their breakfasts, their errands, their ordinary Saturday plans. And meanwhile, the vaults sealed their doors. Those who had been taking warning seriously and those who happened to hear and head to a near shelter when the sirens began were fortunate to find themselves descending into the underground facilities that Vault-Tec had constructed. The great gear-shaped doors rolled shut behind them, cutting them off from the world above. Most of them would never see the sky again for years, if ever. Others sought shelter where they could, basements and subway tunnels, drainage systems and sewer networks, any underground space that might offer protection from what was coming. Some found safety in caves and mines and the deep places of the earth that had nothing to do with Vault-Tec's grand projects. They huddled in darkness and waited. On the surface, the bombs continued to fall. The exchange lasted approximately 2 hours. 2 hours to reshape the world. 2 hours to end a civilization that had taken centuries to build. Cities burned. Infrastructure collapsed. The landscape itself was transformed by the force of the detonations. In Las Vegas, a man named Robert House had prepared for this moment. His defense system engaged, attempting to intercept the 77 warheads targeted at the city. 59 were disabled through transmitting codes. 9 more were destroyed by laser cannons mounted on its casino tower, and the rest got through, striking the surrounding areas. But the city center itself was largely spared. House had been expecting a vital component to arrive that afternoon, a data chip that would improve his defenses. It never came. He was 20 hours short of being fully prepared. Elsewhere, there was no such preparation. Salt Lake City was struck by 13 warheads. The research facility at West-Tec took a direct hit, cracking open containment vessels and released experimental compounds into the atmosphere. Military bases were targeted, industrial centers were destroyed. The geography of a nation was rewritten in fire and radiation. By the time the last warhead detonated, silence had fallen across much of the country. The electromagnetic pulses from the blasts disabled communications equipment. The centralized systems that coordinated emergency response had gone dark. Those who survived the initial exchange found themselves isolated, cut off from information, uncertain whether anyone else remained. The clocks stopped, many of them frozen by the pulses or simply abandoned in that terrible morning, would remain fixed in that moment that everything changed. 9:47, the hands often read. A permanent record of the instant when the old world ended and something else began. 2 hours. That was all it took. When the morning had begun, there had been nations and governments, cities and systems, plans and futures. By midday, there was only the aftermath. The storms of World War had come again, and in its wake, it left a silence that would take generations to fill. The silence came first. Not the absence of sound entirely, but the absence of sounds that had defined a civilization. Radio stations went quiet. Television signals disappeared. The hum of electric grids faded to nothing across vast stretches of the country. The electromagnetic pulses from the detonations had reached further than the fire itself, disabled communications equipment, shutting down the systems that connected so many people to one another and the structures of their society. Emergency response units had been mobilized the evening before. The National Guard had received their orders, preparing for something that military planners had long anticipated. But when the bombs fell, these responders found themselves cut off from any centralized command. Their radios produced only static. Their coordination systems had gone dark. Each unit, each station, each group of first responders became an island, isolated from the larger network that was supposed to guide them. Some continued their duties anyway, Firefighters and paramedics and police officers moved through the wreckage of their communities, doing what they had been trained to do. They established a triage area, searched for survivors. They tried to maintain some semblance of order in places where order had ceased to have ever meaning. These were the people who had sworn to help, and many kept that promise, even when no one was watching, even when no instructions came, even when it became clear that no relief was on its way. But the scale of what happened was beyond any preparation. Supplies ran out quickly. The shipments that were supposed to replenish emergency stockpiles never arrived. Medical facilities filled beyond capacity, and went beyond that. Until there was no more room and no more medicine, whiskey and painkillers became the only comfort available to many of the injured. The careful protocols for triage gave way to grimmer calculations about who might be saved and who might not. Radiation sickness began to manifest in days. The symptoms were unfamiliar to most people. Nausea and vomiting, hair falling out, the slow failure of the body's systems. For those who had survived the initial blasts but had been exposed to the fallout, there was often nothing to do but wait. The morale of the responders crumbled under the weight of helplessness. Many deserted their posts, not out of cowardness necessarily, but out of the realization that the structure they served no longer existed. The chain of command had dissolved. The government that had given them authority was gone, or at least unreachable. What obligation remained when everything that had created that obligation had vanished? About a week after the bombs fell, the rain came. It was not the rain that people remembered from before. This rain was black, thick with soot and ash and radioactive particles that had been thrown in the atmosphere by the detonations. It fell for days, and where it fell, it poisoned. Plants that survived initial destruction withered, and animals that drank the water sickened. The rain was supposed to be cleansing, but this rain brought only more contamination, more death, more silence. In Bakersfield, the people had rushed their local vault when they realized what was happening. Vault 12, it was called, and it had been advertised with all the amenities a shelter could provide. But when the survivors arrived, they discovered that the door would not seal properly. Radiation seeped through the gap. Those who stayed began to change. Their bodies transformed by the constant exposure. They became something new, something that would later be called ghouls. The vault had failed them, though whether by accident or design would remain clear for a long, long time. Elsewhere, in a military base called Mariposa, a different kind of survival was taking place. Captain Roger Maxson and his soldiers had been stationed there where the war began. 2 days after the bombs fell, he ordered the people to prepare to leave. A sergeant volunteered to go outside in power armor and take readings from the atmosphere. The radiation, he reported, was not as severe as they had feared. On October 27th, 4 days after the world ended, soldiers and their families left the base and began walking south toward the government bunker. They would become something else in time too. They would call themselves the Brotherhood of Steel. But most people had no military training, no power armor, no plan. They huddled in basements and sewers, and anywhere else that seemed to offer protection. They rationed whatever food and water they had managed to gather. They listened to the silence and waited for something to change. The vaults remained sealed. Inside, the inhabitants were protected from the worst of what was happening on the surface. They had filtered air and clean water and stored supplies. They didn't know what was occurring outside their doors. They could only follow their protocols and trust that the systems designed to protect them were functioning as intended. On the surface, the systems had all stopped. Power plants went offline. The water treatment facilities ceased operations. The infrastructure that had supported hundreds of millions of people simply ended, and nothing replaced it. In cities that had not been directly struck, the collapse came more slowly, but just as certainly. without electricity, without supply chains, without 1,000 interconnected processes that made modern life possible, survival became a matter of immediate necessity rather than comfortable assumption. The dead outnumbered the living by margins no one could ever accurately calculate. Some estimates would later suggest over 7 billion people perished in the war and its immediate aftermath. The number was too large to comprehend, too vast to mourn. It was simply the new world. Most of humanity had been erased, and those who remained had to find ways to continue. The years following were not kind. Though the bombs fell in 2 hours, the dying took much longer. In the months and years that followed October 23rd, 2077, the survivors who had made it through the initial catastrophe faced a different kind of struggle. This was not the sudden violence of nuclear fire, but the slow, grinding work of learning to exist in a place that no longer wanted them. The radiation lingered for longer than anyone had expected. Military training had taught soldiers that fallout would clear within 2 to 4 weeks. Reality proved otherwise. In some places, the contamination persisted for months. In others, it would remain dangerous for decades or centuries. Those who ventured out too soon, trusting the old timelines, often paid for that trust with their lives or their health. The munitions began to appear. Animals changed, their bodies warped by radiation and other compounds released into the environment. Insects grew larger. Creatures became more aggressive, more resilient, better adapted to the poison landscape than humans who created it. The flora changed too. Plants that had survived developed new characteristics, some becoming edible, others becoming dangerous in ways that they'd never been before. By 2080, mutated life had become visible across the wasteland. In places like Zion Canyon, a former soldier named Randall Clark watched from his cave as new species emerged. He noted them in his journal. Larger flies, strange dragonfly-like creatures, animals he had no names for. The world was remaking itself, and he was simply a witness. Food became the organizational principle of survival. Those who had stockpiled resources lived longer. Those who learned to identify safe plants and hunt mutated game developed skills that could be traded or taught. Those who had neither often turned to darker methods. Raider groups formed as winter approached in 2097, born from desperation and the collapse of any authority that might have restrained them. The Khans and Vipers emerged during this period, groups that would terrorize settlements for generations. Some communities managed to establish themselves despite everything. In the summer of 2083, the survivors of Vault 12 in Bakersfield, transformed by radiation into ghouls, emerged from their failed shelter and founded a settlement they called Necropolis. It was a city of the dead, populated by people who were no longer quite human, but who still needed a community, still needed structure, still needed something to build. The following spring, a ghoul named Set seized control of Necropolis, driving out the original overseer. His rule was harsh, but stable. The city survived because he made it survive, through force and cunning, and a simple refusal to let it fall apart. At Lost Hills in California, the soldiers who had walked away from Mariposa under Captain Roger Maxson were building something different. In 2082, Maxson formally established what he called the Brotherhood of Steel. It was part military organization, part preservation society, dedicated to gathering and protecting the technological knowledge that had survived the war. They believed that something needed to safeguard the old learning, to prevent it from being lost entirely in the chaos of the new world. Other vaults began to open. Vault 8 unsealed its doors in 2091, and its inhabitants used their supplies to establish Vault City, one of the first stable settlements in the wasteland. A year later, the Los Angeles demonstration vault opened, and its residents founded a community with what would later become known as the Boneyard. Vault 15 followed in 2097, to its population would scatter, some forming settlements and others becoming raiders. Not all who emerged from the vaults found success. Some discovered that the outside world was harsh, too different from the controlled environment they had known. Some were killed by radiation, or raiders, or by simply the inability to find food and clean water. The vaults had preserved them, but they had not prepared them for what preservation meant when the doors finally opened. In the spaces between settlements, individual survivors carved out their own existences. They scavenged from the ruins of the old world, trading what they found and what they needed. They learned which areas were safe and which would kill them. They developed the skills that would define Wasteland for centuries. How to purify water, how to treat radiation sickness, and how to recognize danger before it arrived. The first decade after the war was a time of sorting. The weak died, the unlucky died. Those who survived were the ones who adapted, who found shelter and sustenance, who built or joined communities that could protect them. It was brutal and random and awfully deeply unfair. Children who had done nothing wrong perished because they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Adults who had been good people before the war became monsters because circumstances demanded it. But life continued, and that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about those early years. Despite everything, despite the radiation and the mutations and the collapse of every system that had made civilization possible, people kept living. They had children. They planted crops in irradiated soil, and they repaired machines with salvaged parts. They told stories about the world that had been made and plans for the world that might come. The wasteland was being born, and its birth was painful and slow and marked by countless small tragedies. But it was happening. Something new was emerging from the ashes of what had been destroyed, and though none could yet say what shape it would take, the process had begun. "200 years is a long time to remember anything clearly. The people who lived through October 23rd, 2077 are mostly gone now. The ghouls who survived, their bodies preserved by the same radiation that transformed them, carry fragments of memory. But even they struggle to piece together exactly what happened and why. The simplest questions have uncertain answers. Who fired first? Some say China, pressed against the wall, but rumors persist about Vault-Tec having secret motives beyond protection. But no evidence ever surfaced that they instigated the Great War. A few speak of rogue nations or accidents or machines that made decisions no human authorized. The truth, if it exists, lies buried under 2 centuries of rubble and ash. Even the time of day has become unclear. Clocks across the East Coast stopped at 9:47, but accounts from other regions speak of night, of darkness where the sky lit up. Perhaps it was simply the time zones, the war sweeping across the continent as the earth turned. Perhaps the records are wrong, perhaps Vault-Tec are to blame, and perhaps memory itself has failed. What survives are stories. Grandparents told children who told their own children who told theirs. Each telling changed things slightly. Details were added or lost, and the war became myth, then legend, and something almost religious. Some settlements marked October 23rd as a day of mourning, and others have forgotten the date entirely, knowing that there was only a before and there was an after, and after is all they've ever known. The old world left behind its artifacts. Terminals still hold records if anyone can access them. Holotapes preserved voices of people long dead, speaking of events they barely understood, even as they lived through them. But these fragments tell incomplete stories. A military log describes missiles without explaining why. A personal diary ends mid-sentence. The pictures never quite come together. But the uncertainty has become part of the wasteland itself. People argue about the old world and the way they argue about everything else. They form beliefs based on partial evidence and defend those beliefs against any who disagree. The Great War has become less of a historical event and more the kind of scripture. interpreted differently by different communities, used to justify whatever needs justifying. And maybe that's fitting. The war was confusion when it happened, 2 hours of chaos that no single person could comprehend. And why should the memory be any clearer than the event itself? The bombs fell, the world changed, and everything else is just stories in the dark, passed from one generation to the next, growing stronger with each telling. The wasteland that emerged in the ashes of the Great War was not a single place, but many. Each region developed differently, shaped by particular circumstances of its own destruction and its survival. What remained consistent was the struggle, the slow process of rebuilding something from nothing, and the emergence of groups that would come to define a new world. In California, survivors of Vault 15 emerged to the harsh light of a wasteland around 2097. The vault had been deliberately overcrowded, filled with people with radically different backgrounds and beliefs. When the doors opened, this pressure released in different directions. Some groups turned violent, forming the raider clans that would terrorize the region for generations. The Khans, the Vipers, the Jackals. Others chose differently. A group led by ancestors of a man named Aradesh traveled west and founded a small settlement called Shady Sands. Using salvaged equipment and whatever seeds they could find, they established farms and dug wells. They built walls, and they created something that resembled a community, fragile but persistent. Similar stories played out all across the wasteland. Junktown rose from scavenging materials. The hub became a center of trade. Its merchants established routes between settlements, and the boneyard, built in the ruins of Los Angeles, sheltered survivors who had crawled from the wreckage of the demonstration vault. Each community faced its own challenges, its own raiders, its own shortages, and each found its own ways to survive. The Brotherhood of Steel, founded by Roger Maxson after the exodus from Mariposa, grew quietly in their bunker at Lost Hills. They collected technology, preserved knowledge, trained their members in the old military traditions. They were isolationist by nature, suspicious of the outsiders, convinced that they alone understood the importance of safeguarding the dangerous tools of the old world. Not all threats came from raiders or radiation. In 2102, a man named Richard Gray led an expedition to investigate the source of strange creatures attacking caravans. At the Mariposa military base, he fell into the vats of the forced evolutionary virus, the same compound the pre-war military had developed in secret. The exposure transformed him into something no longer human. He became the Master, and he began to dream of remaking humanity itself. Over the following decades, the Master built an army. He used a virus to create super mutants, towering creatures of immense strength and varying intelligence. He established a cult called the Children of the Cathedral to spread his influence. He captured humans from caravans and settlements, transforming them or destroying them. His unity, as he called it, grew in the shadows, prepared for the day where it would emerge and forcibly evolve all of humanity into a single unified species. The wasteland remained unaware of the full scope of this threat for decades. Settlements traded and fought and grew and collapsed, following the rhythms of survival. Raiders attacked, mutated creatures roamed, clean water remained precious. Life was difficult, but possible, at least for those strong or lucky or clever enough to endure. By 2161, 84 years after the bombs fell, the world had settled into a kind of equilibrium. The immediate chaos of the aftermath had given way to established patterns. Communities knew their neighbors, their enemies, their trade routes. The Brotherhood maintained its technology vigil. The Master's army continued its secret growth. Shady Sands prospered under Aradash's leadership, and his daughter Tandy grew into a young woman who would one day shape the future of the entire region. It was in this year that the water purifier chip in Vault 13 finally failed. The Overseer was desperate enough to save his community and sent a young resident out into the wasteland to find a replacement. This person, known as the Vault Dweller, would stumble into a world far more complex and dangerous than anyone inside the Vault had imagined. The Vault Dweller would discover Shady Sands and help defend it from raiders, would venture to Necropolis to encounter the ghouls who had survived since the war, would learn of the Master's army and the threat it posed and every human settlement in the region, would eventually destroy the Master and his vats and ending Unity's dream of forced evolution. But that story belongs to another telling. What matters here is the Wasteland, by 2161, had become something. Not civilization as it has existed before, but something new. Communities connected by trade and conflict, factions with ideologies and goals, technology preserved and scavenged and sometimes created anew. A world harsh and violent and strange, but also alive with possibility. The Great War had ended everything that came before, and what emerged in its wake was still taking shape, still defining itself, still struggling toward whatever future it might find. The bombs that created the wasteland, the people who survived, would determine what it became. The world before the war is gone now, though, dear listener. It exists only in fragments, faded posters, and crumbling walls. Terminals still flicker with messages that no one will ever read. The skeletal frames of building that once housed families, businesses, dreams. What remains is the memory, and memories fade with each passing generation. Perhaps that is as it should be. The old world made choices that led to its own destruction. The resource wars, the annexations, the slow accumulation of tensions that finally ignited into 2 hours of nuclear fire. Those who lived through it could not have imagined what would follow, and those who came after could only piece together what happened from ruins and records and stories told in the dark. The clocks at 9:47, the sirens' wails, it was all ignored. The vaults sealed their doors, and then silence. Silence across the land, broken only by wind and fire and a slow settling of dust. It was an ending, yes, but it was also a beginning, though no one knew it at the time. The wasteland that emerged is not a kind place, dear listener. It reminds much of those who live in it. Clean water is precious, and food must be grown in irradiated soil or hunted from mutated creatures. Safety is never guaranteed. It's earned. Earned through vigilance and strength, and the willingness to work with others. The comfortable assumptions of the old world, of no place here. And yet, people persist. They build settlements and raise children. They establish trade routes and they form governments. They create art and music and stories. They fall in love. They grieve. And they hope for better days. The human capacity for survival, for adaptation, for finding meaning even in the harshest circumstances has not been extinguished. It's only been tested. The Vault Dweller who emerged in 2161 was not the first to venture out into the wasteland, nor would they be the last. Before them came scouts and scavengers and soldiers and settlers, all the unnamed people who took the first steps into the unknown. After them would come others, each with their own journey, their own struggles, their own small contributions to the slow rebuilding of civilization. But those stories can wait for another time. For now, let the wasteland settle into stillness. Let the wind die down across the empty highways. Let the stars emerge from above the ruins. The same stars that shone before the war, and will shine long for the last traces of humanity may have faded. The Great War was a tragedy. The lives lost, the knowledge destroyed, the potential futures erased. All of it represents a wound that may never fully heal. But tragedy is not the end of the story. It's only a turning point, a moment when everything changes and new possibilities emerge from the wreckage of the old. So rest now, dear listener. The wasteland will still be there when you wake. The settlements will continue their patient work of survival. The factions will pursue their visions. The mysteries of the old world will wait to be discovered. There's time enough for all of it. The bombs fell long ago. The fires have cooled. The radiation in most places has faded to tolerable levels. what remains of a world transformed, harsh and beautiful and strange, waiting for those brave enough to explore it. But not tonight. Tonight, let the silence settle. Let the distant hum of a generator fade into background noise. Let the wasteland rest, and rest with it. War never changes, but perhaps in time, everything else can. Sleep well, dear listener.